Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our sixth webinar, ML4LM webinar. And today, investigating the complex process involved in the water, energy, and carbon cycle and how to better predict them. Our today's speaker, Professor Pierre Gentine, explores research avenues combining data-driven and process-based modeling. And he will introduce there a new differentiable land model, DifferLand, that try to push the boundary for hybrid and physics-informed machine learning. And Pierre is a professor of geophysics in the Department of Earth and Environmental Engineering and Earth and Environmental Science at Columbia University. He studies the terrestrial water and carbon cycle and their evolution with climate change. Pierre also received several awards, such as the NSF, NASA, and Department of Energy Early Career Award, the AGU Global Environmental Change Early Career McIlwain Medal, and the AMS Mazinger Award. He's currently the director of the NSF Science and Technology Center for Learning the Earth with Artificial Intelligence and Physics, long name, making short STC LEAP, the largest funding mechanism of the NSF right now. And then I will give the floor to Professor Pierre Gentine. Over to you, Pierre. Thank you.
Thanks, Will. Yeah, and thanks a lot for the invitation. So I wanted to present the work mostly from a great student, Jianing Fang. He's actually interning right now at Google and trying to actually use DifferLand with the neural GCM. So if you've heard about neural GCM, that's another differentiable model that's being used for the atmosphere, and they are trying to couple the two of them. There are also a couple of colleagues involved. So Kevin Bonnen at JPL, Shulian, former postdoc at Columbia, and Wenli Zhao is also a postdoc at Columbia. And I'll try to frame that in terms of why we wanted to use this model is to really answer science questions. And the way I felt about that is that I'm very interested in land modeling, as you would suspect, but I oftentimes felt that they were not really up to the task of many of the questions that we had, and it was just very challenging to do many of the things we wanted to do, including data assimilation, trying to infer parameters, but also trying to understand like structural functions, within models. And so I structured this talk in terms of two areas where we can use this differentiability. And if you're not familiar with differentiability, it's really the fact that we can take gradients through the model. And why that's actually a powerful tool is because once you can take gradients, you can really leverage many of the tools that we have in machine learning, such as backpropagation, which is really the backbone of modern AI. And what I also mean here by differentiability, I actually got the question from Anne Verhoef last week, is not just taking gradients to a few parameters, but here we can take gradients to anything within the model, right? And what I mean by that is we can really take gradients to the state, to initial conditions, to parameters, but potentially to even more complex structural forms, right? Which could be a neural network. So you can really think of that, those are like Legos. I mean, that's my view of the world, maybe being too much around kids. But really it's having Legos where you can actually play with those and you can actually extract information as long as you have enough data, but also being very modular. So at times when you have data, you can be very flexible and then trying to learn everything. But when you don't have data, of course, you need to rely on physics as much as you can. And oftentimes you also have conservation laws that you want to respect. So that would be a mistake to actually give them away. So I'll try to explain how we can use that for two targets that we were interested in. The first one is in terms of retrieving model traits or parameters at the global scale and how that can be done optimally within that kind of framework, and why differentiability is very useful for that. And then the second one is going to be more in terms of model structure, right? When we are going to look at water stress in particular. So just to begin with looking at functional diversity. So we were very interested in thinking about how there could be covariations in traits and parameters within, land modeling in general, but really just the land surface more specifically. And just the fact that, there's a lot of covariations, especially across space, across climate, across plant functional types. And we tend to have a very, how can I say, a very relatively simplified view of the world when we are dealing with a land surface model. We tend to slice the world in what we call plant functional types. And within those plant functional types, we tend to have fixed parameters within that group, right? And we want it to be a little bit more open than that, and saying, can we have a little bit more flavor to that? And you can have a lot of things that can actually push the covariation in space. That could be gradients in climate or the landscape or topography within the landscape. But it also means that oftentimes what we see is that when we look at many of the different traits or many of the different parameters within the model, first of all, they are not fixed, but more than that, they typically co-evolve in a subspace, which really means that, so that was a nice work from Miglietti and colleagues showing that typically traits or parameters tend to be in a subspace that is actually a lot correlated, right? So we have a lot of correlations in the traits and parameters that are defined by climate, by the type of plants and species we are looking at. And so we'd like to actually kind of understand that at the global scale. So how are those traits or parameters really functioning at the global space? And what is kind of this lower effective, you could think of that latent space. So what's the lower effective dimensionality of many of those traits and parameters? So how do we actually infer that at the global scale? So in terms of spatial distribution, we have different ways typically of slicing the world. The typical way when we look at an Earth system model or land surface model that's being run, especially at the global scale, is to slice the world in terms of broad classes, which are plant functional types. So evergreen broadleaf forest, deciduous broadleaf forest, and so on and so forth. That's the typical strategy that we have within those coarse resolution models, but that lacks a lot of the sub plant functional type variation. For instance, species will actually create much more gradients across those. We could also have climate adaptation, right? You could have some adaptation to local climate of those traits that would actually potentially move us away from like strict fixed values in plant functional types. We could also use machine learning. So people have done a lot of upscaling. You take point data, and what you try to do is actually getting an upscaled version at the global scale. One of the issues there is that you need to make sure that the upscaling functions really well, and that you're capturing a lot of the relationship, for instance, as a function of climate or some other components. And that can be really challenging, especially if we have very sparse data, which tends to be the case. We can have very nice, good and accurate data, for instance, for eddy covariance sites, but they tend to be still very sparse at the global scale. So they might not be representative of the whole diversity we are seeing at the global scale. And then kind of the last strategy, and that's a lot more in the direction we are going to in that particular case, such as from the cardamom model, from colleagues, especially at JPL, is to think about a Bayesian model data fusion, where we could actually have a physics-based model, typically a dynamical system. And then we are going to be retrieving some parameters that are optimized, and they could be optimized locally, or they could be optimized on a larger area. And that's kind of this Bayesian model data fusion. So we could optimize the parameters. But the issue there is that typically that's being done pixel-wise, and that's really missing a lot of the cross variations we can have in space. And oftentimes we also have very limited sampling data. So most likely what's going to happen when we use that strategy is we could have a lot of overfitting, right? Because we have very few data points, especially if we use daily to monthly data or weekly to monthly data, we will have very limited data points. So the uncertainties can be quite large when we think about those parameters and the retrieval of those parameters. So that can be problematic. So the strategy that we had here was to develop a model again. So this model, which is actually based on cardamom, it's moved to a higher level language, so that's written in Python, so that it's much easier to use. But what we use as a backend, we use a machine learning algorithm or library, which is called JAX, which is the Google machine learning library. If you know PyTorch, it's kind of a different version, but it's kind of within the same type of umbrella in a sense, but that's a relatively modern infrastructure. It really allows for kind of hardware agnostic computation. So we can run on CPUs, we can run on GPUs. That's just one line of code roughly that you need to change, and makes it also very agile. So if you want to run it on your laptop, that's fine. If you want to run it on, say, the cloud, or if you want to run it on a high performance computer, so that's relatively straightforward to do in that case. And what we decided to do is trying to retrieve many of the parameters. So we have, again, at the global scale, many pixels. And we have some key parameters of the model, which is, again, based on cardamom. So it's a relatively simplified land model in the sense that we have carbon and water pools in that case. And what we try to do is trying to understand how those parameters were actually varying at the global scale. So those are some of the examples. So you have a couple of parameters that are regulating mostly physiology and phenology, right? So you have a bunch of those. You have longer term parameters that are regulating carbon allocation, again, at the global scale, and carbon turnover time. And then you have some other last components that are related especially to stress and disturbance. So those are kind of the 4 big categories that we have, and you have a bunch of parameters across all of those. And then basically to go beyond what I mentioned before, this kind of pixel-wise fitting, what we thought is we said, what we know is that there should be some sort of relationship in space between those different parameters. So we know that going beyond a simple plan functional type, there could be some climate dependence or some topography dependence of some of the parameters. And so what we are going to do is we are going to just say that the parameters that we are going to be retrieving at the pixel level or pixel-wise here are going to be dependent on plan functional type, obviously, because that's what most land surface models do, but we are going to add some additional components. So we are trying to go beyond plan functional type. We are going to add climate. We are going to add also forest age, because that's also very important for carbon use efficiency. And that was one of our interests here. And also you could add some other things. So for instance, soil type, we believe could be quite important for many of the things we are looking at, especially carbon turnover rates. So that's what we wanted to do. And that now what we are going to do is we are going to say, there's a relationship between the pixel-wise values that we have here and those parameters, so those features that we have as an entry, and we are just going to learn that, right? We are not imposing any of the structure that we have here, and we are just going to learn that because the model is, again, differentiable, so we can optimize the whole model end-to-end. And we're going to use observations that you see here on the right-hand side from satellite observations, but also from in-situ observations, and we're going to train all of that together. So we have basically sparse observations in time and space. We backpropagate that, so that's the arrow you can see here. We backpropagate that to basically optimize values at individual pixel level, but we respect that structure that we built here, so as a function of plant functional type, climate, age, and soil. And so at the end, what we should get is we should get a bunch of maps of parameters here that respect the structure from PFT, climate, age, and soil, that is trying to optimize the values that we have at a particular level. So you could think of that this way. You have some spatial predictors here. They go into a spatialization network. So we have a bunch, those are all the parameters we have. So plant functional type, you have, for instance, mean annual temperature, mean annual precipitation, elevation, plug that into a spatialization network. That's going to predict a bunch of parameters here for each individual pixel. We couple that to the atmospheric forcing. So we have a time series here, and then we are going to map each individual time series, and we are going to compare that to the observations. And again, the observations can be sparse in space and time. They can be coming from sensors, they can be coming from remote sensing, and we just optimize the whole thing end to end. So that's how it works. We have the mechanistic model. So again, you could think of that, it looks like cardamom. We have a bunch of carbon pools, water pools. We are simulating the mass evolution and of those pools. And then what we have is we simulate the evolution, but we can also get observations. And the big advantage that we have is because when you think of the observation operator of remote sensing product or remote sensing of some remote sensing data, you can actually think of that, you can also take the gradient. That's what we typically do in data assimilation. So we can actually use also the differentiability for the assimilation piece as well. So we have our spatialization network that's going to control how those parameters are going to vary spatially. We assimilate observations from satellite data and in situ observations, and we can have indirect observations. So we can have the observation operator, all of that, we can take gradients through. And then what we do is we optimize this whole thing. So we have the back propagation here, same using exactly the machine learning type structure to optimize this spatialization network and how the different parameters are going to vary spatially as a function of climate, PFT, soil, and age. And then what we can do is we can then use the model for three things. We can use it for the forecasting piece, right? We can predict, for instance, the carbon uptake at the global scale. We can map, and that's our primary interest here, is we can map the ecological parameters that we are retrieving through this end-to-end learning. And we can also use, and I'm going to show you one example at the end, we can actually use that also to learn how the parameters are going to vary as a function of the parameters that we had here. Basically, we can open up the black box that we have here, this spatialization network. We can just learn what the model has retrieved based on the observation. So what the model can do is it can be multi-resolution because it really doesn't matter. Like we can assimilate at various points. It can be sparse in time and space. That's really no problem in that case. It can be multi-source in terms of spatial and temporal constraints. So that's fine. The model is pretty efficient. Again, it can be run on GPUs. It's fully differentiable. So and that can be the differentiability is also across time. So that's not just at individual snapshots, but we have the consistency of the mass balance for water and carbon and energy now across time. So we can actually propagate the gradients across time. So if you're familiar with the neural GCN that was recently published by Google, this is very similar type approach. You can actually propagate those gradients across. And also we have this additional layer that we added to that, which is this explainable AI component, so that you can get more interpretability of the results, so that it goes beyond black box type structure. So the model, again, is very much inspired by carbon. So this is the first version. So where we had coupled carbon and water pools, we have a bunch of relatively simplified carbon pools. So you have foliar, wood, labile, soil, litter, and fine roots. We, of course, have fluxes that go in between. Sorry. And then we have the water pools as well. So we have some plant available water in the meantime as well. And then we couple those two. So they are coupled through the coupling between photosynthesis and transpiration, and through what we call the underlying water use efficiency. And we run that model again forward in time, and we can optimize that based on observations. So the observations we are using to constrain the model are, for GPP, we use some observations from remote sensing. So basically you could think of that some vegetation index that we've developed in the group. We use some site level eddy covariance products as well. So we can have global observations, but also local observations. We can have some constraints on ecosystem respiration as well. So the total here of the respiration flux. At sites, we can have some information on leaf area index as well. We can have some constraints on the total amount of above ground biomass that we get from satellite data, from microwave data in that particular case. And then we can have some other estimates of live biomass as well, more static maps through. And then we also have some additional constraints coming from GRACE in terms of total plant available water, so that we have terrestrial water storage in the soil as a constraint. So one of the work we are going to do next is also like slicing that and adding also SMAP data as part of that. And then we also use estimates of evapotranspiration. So we have direct observations at in situ sites from eddy covariance sites, and we also have beam retrievals of evapotranspiration as well. And we are trying to move beyond that. So we directly have some thermal infrared constraints. So now we have energy, water, and carbon coupling. So that's the new version. I'm not showing that here. And finally, we also have some flux inversions for carbon flux inversion. So we don't have just a big constraint on photosynthesis at the global scale, but we also have some inversion product as well. And then fire, because we need some disturbance. Okay, so then what we do is we try to be very careful about the split, making sure that there's no autocorrelation in time and space. We train the model, we evaluate that, and we try to be very careful between test data and train data. So this is an example of the test pixels or areas that are being used, and then the train data that's here. And we also slice that in time so that there's no autocorrelation to make sure that there's no data leakage. And then what we do is we have, again, this top-down constraints. So this is an example here of the model compared to the observations for the atmospheric inversion. And you can see that the model is actually doing a good job. So the model is here depicted in blue, and this is the CMS inversions across different sites. So this is at the global scale. This is North American boreal sites, South American tropical, South American temperate, South Africa, Eurasia. And you can see that we have a good seasonal cycle. We've actually even improved compared to that version, the interannual variability. So now we are very happy with the interannual variability, and we are picking up especially times of droughts or El Nino relatively well. And then we also have kind of the big advantage of the model is it can ingest any type of source of data, and that can be global, but that can also be at the local scale. And we can actually assimilate data from any covariance tower as well. So that tends to work quite well. And again, this is across sites here, across plant functional types, and we feel that that's working relatively well. We can look at this, the test regions I showed you before. So again, they've never been seen across time and space as part of the training data. And we can look at, once we've tweaked all of the parameters at the global scale, how good of a job we are doing in that particular region. So again, we've never seen that, but we get parameters there based on the structure that we learned at the global scale as a function of plant functional type, climate, soil, and forest age. And what we can find is that in terms of leaf area index, fluorescence, so as a proxy of photosynthesis, net ecosystem exchange, water anomaly, that's based on grays, vegetation optical depths, live biomass, ET, and fire emission, that's mostly prescribed. But for the rest, we can see we feel a good job at retrieving many of those properties, even though, again, that was not part of the training data. So it seems that we can do a good job even outside of the training set. Once we have that, so again, what we've done is we've trained the model globally. We can actually include the test set now. And we can look at the maps of the retrieved parameters, and we can say, so let me just go back quickly to the initial model. We can actually look into that spatialization network. We can look at how are the different parameters that we have here dependent on the different factors that or the different features, climate, plant functional type, soil type, and age, and how are they explaining the latent variables that we have here. And what we can find once we do that is we can basically try to uncover this black box or the structure that we have. And the important point for us was trying to see how much of the variability of what is being predicted, so leaf area index or net ecosystem exchange, fluorescence, or so water storage or vegetation optical depth. So how much of that is due to plant functional type, because that's the way we typically slice the world in a land surface model, and how much of that is explained by other factors, such as climate. So if it's climate, you could think of that this is adaptation of traits or parameters to local climate, or to some other things, such as forest age. We would suspect that forest age would be very important for carbon use efficiency, because that's regulating the ratio between photosynthesis and respiration at the ecosystem scale. So we wanted to just dig into what we learned at the global scale. So again, we didn't impose any structure here. all of that was learned by just the assimilation of the data and the remote sensing data, but also from the eddy flux, eddy covariance tower data. And what we can find is that if we look at plant functional type, you can see that for leaf area index, it's explaining a fair amount of the variability that we see in space. So that's the spatial variance that you see. But very importantly, if we look at climate, you can see that for leaf area index, it explains a fair amount of that. But for net ecosystem exchange, it has a huge impact, which is actually basically larger than than what we would expect for the other factor, So, and that's actually very important to see that this is actually different from photosynthesis, right? So you can see that climate might have a very strong impact in terms of the net ecosystem exchange as opposed to fluorescence component. And then the other point that's actually very important is in terms of age. What's the impact of forest age? We used a relatively simplified map of age. So we are actually working actively in trying to actually get better estimates of that. But the main point being is the same, is that for fluorescence or for photosynthesis, you would expect age because there's some sort of saturation effect relatively quickly as a function of age. So photosynthesis tends to saturate as a function of forest age. But what we know is that age should have a strong impact even after many, many years or decades on forest respiration. And that's what we can see here. We can see that there's a higher percentage of the variance explained by age than what we see on photosynthesis. So that's really in agreement with what we would expect, I would say. The second advantage of the model is once you have that, we can actually perform all of that in a Bayesian way. We can also look at explainability of the different factors and the parameters that we are retrieving. For instance, you could have the Fourier time scale here, turnover rate, and you can see how much of those are constrainable by the observations and how much of those are actually non-constrainable or non-identifiable by the observations. And what we can find is that, as you would suspect, many of the soil or root components cannot be constrained or cannot be identified by the retrieval that we have, especially from the satellite products. So in other words, if we had to acquire data, we should try to acquire data here to put more constraints on those parameters and putting more constraints on the carbon and water cycle in that particular area. So a lot of them are actually related to litter, roots, and soil organic matters, as you would expect. So really no surprise there. There's not a whole lot we can get from satellite products, but that's a good way because the model can be used to identify areas where we could actually invest into like new missions or new areas of observations to improve the estimate. We can look further and look at again this NPP to GPP ratio, and we can compare to some of the other products, and we can see that we are in relatively good agreements with DifferLand, with the site observation. So again, pointing out to the fact that the model seems to be quite reasonable in terms of the estimates we are getting. We can also look at some specific components, so especially Q10, and we can compare that to some other retrievals. So for instance, paper by Zhu et al., which is at site level, and we can see that the Q10 we're getting across the different plant functional type is very much in agreement with this in situ sampling of that. So again, a way to build confidence in what is being retrieved, because you could think of that, we are just ingesting a lot of data. It could be challenging, but we are actually trying to get all of that intended. And finally, what we can do is we can use, as I mentioned, this kind of explainability tool. So we can dig into the model itself, and we can say what was really learned by the neural network and that dependence of the different parameters or the traits as a function of climate and in particular, or tree age. And what we can see is that we can, for instance, if we look at one of those parameters that we have, which is the so-called canopy photosynthetic efficiency, we can see that there's an optimal temperature, that was learned by the model. Again, it was not imposed by the model, but we can directly retrieve that through the assimilation and the fact that we are optimizing the model at the global scale. So that's very much, again, in agreement with what we would expect, except that, again, nothing was imposed. We are just retrieving that directly from the model. You could also look at the impact of tree age on photosynthetic efficiency, and similarly, you would also expect that this is actually changing and decreasing as a function of 3H, which is also in agreement with our expectation. So, and you can go through, for instance, similar things, for instance, for Q10 and looking at the impact of age and canopy height, which are strongly correlated, and looking at the impact on respiration at the ecosystem scale. And finally, once you have that, you can actually look at those parameters. So this was just a way because you have many parameters, many input features. So what we did is like simple thing is just doing a PCA and looking at what are the main modes of variability of plant traits and plant parameters at the global scale. And just finding from that the three main ones that we can find are growing season lengths, which you can find here. That's really what is controlling most of the parameters that we have here. So we are looking again at this latent space that we've learned, and we're just putting that on like very simplified PCA. And that explains, so the growing season length explains about 50% of the variability. Leaf nitrogen content is explains basically the second most component, and then the third one, which is basically agricultural practice. So again, those were never imposed. We never really imposed the leaf nitrogen content. We never imposed the growing season length. We never imposed the agricultural intensity, but we can just retrieve that based on the different principal components, and they basically align with those major modes of variability that we are aware of from the carbon cycle. So just very quickly on that, just to have a little bit of time to talk about model structure, we can use really this model and the differentiability to do top-down and bottom-up constraints, especially on the global carbon and water cycle. We can look at regional variation, especially in trait-based or parameter-based variability and how that's varying across space. And the latent, so this kind of idealized reduced dimension, so this correlated space, if you will, of the different parameters can really tell us a lot about what's being learned and how plants and ecosystems actually function at the global scale. And again, we can then look into that in a simplified way, looking at some convergent spatial axes. So what are the main spatial axes of variability in space at the global scale? So what is really controlling the main variability of those parameters? So just very quickly in the next couple of minutes, I wanted to very quickly get into another application of this model. It's to look at structural equations. So when we look, for instance, at the carbon cycle, we know that there's a lot of variability in the terrestrial carbon cycle, but a lot of the variability that we have in the carbon cycle is actually quite unknown when we look at a lot of those things. So there's been quite a few papers actually looking at the global scale and the impact that we have from the uncertainties that we have, especially in the relationship between photosynthesis and soil moisture. And many studies have shown that this explains a lot of the inter-model spread that we have and the variability that we have in the carbon cycling. So variability in time, so interannual variability, but also the inter-model spread. A lot of that is controlled by the relationship between photosynthesis and water stress, so basically photosynthesis and soil moisture. So what we'd like to do is we'd like to actually try and assess that as best as we can, and ideally in some sort of optimal way. And so again, here we're going to use this strategy to try and uncover especially the parametric and structural uncertainties that are part of the different uncertainties we can have at the global scale. I'm going to go a bit quicker. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the same strategy we had before, where we are going to use this model. And then what we can do is we can use a so-called hybrid approach. What we mean by that is that we can have a model that can have different bricks, as was actually alluded to by Reinstein and colleague back then. And you can have a model that can have some physical parameters, but it can be combined with potentially some machine learning component. And if we can train all of that end-to-end, so together, and that's where we're using JAX again to do this parametric and structural uncertainty, we can just learn everything together. And by everything here, it could be the initial conditions, the physical parameters, or some potential neural networks that are embedded into that. They are just all parameters after all, right? And so there are some challenges, and I didn't really talk about them before, but to really get the differentiability, it can be challenging because we need to have some mass conservation over time. It can be really challenging to have long rollout and to have long time scales, especially when you have very steep behavior. You know, many of the functions we have in ecology or physiology tend to be very abrupt. So one thing we did is we tried to use some sort of simulated annealing where we have some smooth functions at first, and then we make them sharper and sharper over time. And then if you've worked, for instance, with LSTM, so one of those recurrent neural networks, you also know that you can have vanishing gradients and also exploding gradients over time, very, very similar to that type of thing. And so we have a couple of strategies here so that you can have long rollouts and you can pass on the gradients over time. So it's a bit on the technical side, but just to explain that getting that to work can be challenging. We are relatively happy with what we have now, and we can get those long rollouts. We can also have abrupt functions, and most of that works well, and we can have mass conservation. So we're happy with what we have. Just on the very little technical side, also why we use JAX is we initially started in Julia. We couldn't really make it to work at scale. It's a great language, but it just the cost for really high quality implementation was just too high for us, at least. So in that case, we use JAX, and that really allowed us to actually work at the global scale, and we can work now at the daily time scale, and we managed to get very quickly, roughly 100 times faster implementation than Julia, and a lot faster than the original Fortran code. So that's why now we can go global and we can go at the daily timescale. So what we are going to do is we are going to test the impact of water stress. And what we are going to do as a baseline, we are going to use photosynthesis. We are going to say my water stress function is going to be just unity. So there's just no stress whatsoever. Then we are going to use, as an alternative to that, we are going to use some Jarvis formulation where we just have a linear, piecewise linear formulation. And then we are going to have a lot more subtle version where we can have a full neural network. So we can have a very complex version where the photosynthesis reduction as a function of plant available water can be a very complex function, which can be learned by a neural network. And then we can make that even more complex where the neural network is not just dependent on water, but also on some additional factors here that are related to climate. I won't get too much into that, but you can basically boost up the quality, and especially you can increase the complexity, especially related to the water use efficiency, if you wanted to not impose the water use efficiency, but you wanted to learn that as part of that as well. And what we are going to do is we are going to just plug this neural network as part of the whole model. We are going to just do surgery here, and we are going to replace the water stress function that's regulating photosynthesis. So that's the only thing we changed. The rest is going to be optimized as well. We're going to optimize all of the parameters here to be fair in tandem with the neural network. So we are doing all of that together. So the physics-based parameters and the neural network parameters, we are learning that end to end, and they are self-optimized, right? So they are optimized together. And again, we have different versions. So either you have just a piecewise linear function, or you can have a much more complex version. So the piecewise linear is just here, but you can have the full neural network version, or you could have a version that's changing evapotranspiration and GPP. So you can change the water use efficiency. So we can just test the model complexity. And we are going to test that across multiple flux sites, eddy covariance sites. Of course, we want sites to be dry. So we are going to cover some climate gradients, so we can see from non-water stressed regions, especially Northern Europe, all the way to water stressed regions. And we are going to do the same as what we've done before. We are going to, except that we are testing that at FluxNet sites. We're going to just train the model against observations. We make sure we split the data well between training and validation and test without autocorrelation. And then we just, and we are going to use GBP, ecosystem respiration, evapotranspiration, and LAI as the targets of the model. And then what we do is we can actually compare the results of the model. So this is in terms of Nash Sutcliffe efficiency, so NSE. And we can split between the training part of the data and the test part of the data. And maybe if you just look on the left-hand side here, so those are across different sites here from top to bottom and across different flux types from left to right. And the main take home is that if you have, of course, no water stress, you can see that we are missing quite a bit of variability. And so we are missing quite a bit of efficiency. And then the first component that you have here between train and test is actually the one with the piecewise linear model. And really the main take home here is that if you look at all of the models, so you increase complexity as you go to the right. And you can see that oftentimes when you just look at the test set here, you don't see any major improvement by going to a higher complexity model. And that's true across most of the sites here, from wettest to driest here at the top, right? So, what this seems to imply is that, the top is dry and the bottom is wet. You can see that at the bottom, there's no water stress here in the baseline. And you can see that water stress is important indeed when you get to a dry site. But you can see that there's not a major improvement of getting to a more complex structural form, because especially in terms of the test set, we don't just have enough data to actually retrieve a much more complex structure. So how does it look like? So this is the retrieved piecewise linear version of that. This is at Vera Ranch in the US, in California. This is in France. So you can see the water stress that we are building up. So those are sites where there is water stress. And this is the Harvard site where you can see that there's limited water stress in that particular case, right? So that's consistent with what we would expect. We should not have a major reduction, especially in photosynthesis. As we get into the neural network, you can see the function can be more sophisticated. Here, there's some spread because of seasonal variation in maximum photosynthesis, so no need to worry too much about that. But the main point is that you can get indeed more sophisticated function, and the neural network is trying to get a little bit more than a piecewise linear function, as you can see. And then we can get to more and more complex structural function, but then it gets a lot messier. So that might be just too complex to retrieve. So it seems that this one and the linear, the piecewise linear are okay, basically to retrieve most of the water stress. The advantage of the model is we can train that in a Bayesian way. So we can actually look also at uncertainty quantification. So we don't retrieve just one curve, but we can actually retrieve the curves with the uncertainty. So you could think of that, we are varying the parameters of the model and we retrieve that in a Bayesian way, but the parameters here are the parameters or the weights of a neural network. And therefore they provide an envelope of a family of functions, right? We don't retrieve just one function, we retrieve an envelope of functions. And that can be very convenient, and we can use a lot of nice tools, especially in variational inference, so we can actually get that relatively in an optimal fashion. But that's just a side note here, that we don't have just one curve, but we can actually get the full curve in a Bayesian fashion. And then we can also use some SHAP identification to look at what are the main drivers of the function and of the stress. But the main take home that we had is, if we go back to this, is that what we found is that there's basically very limited advantage in getting to a more complex structure than a piecewise linear. So for most cases, and I should emphasize here, this is at the daily time scale. At the daily time scale, across the sites we've looked at eddy covariance sites, it seems that there's not really any improvement in going beyond a piecewise linear, as long as you optimize where that piecewise linear function is being triggered. So basically the onset of water stress. So that seems that it's basically good enough. There's no need to get beyond that. Of course, if you wanted to go at subdiurnal timescales, that's a place where maybe plant hydraulics would be very important. But for the daily timescale, it seems the conclusion is it seems very difficult to go beyond that. So piecewise linear seems to be good enough. So key takeaways from that. So DifferLand is a relatively flexible land surface model. It's relatively simple for the time being, but it's relatively swappable and interchangeable, so people can change and add complexity as they wish. It's written in high-level language, so it's in Python. It's also ML optimized and enabled in the backend. So we use JAX, which is the relatively efficient infrastructure for that. And it's, as part of that, it's basically hardware agnostic. It can be run on CPU, single CPU, multiple CPUs, GPUs, or whatnot. And it can be used for multiple purposes, but one of them is learning model structure. So I showed you the example of water stress, but people can use that to assess many other things. But it can also be used to do data assimilation at scale to retrieve parameters at the global scale and using top-down and bottom-up constraints. We have the mass conservation as part of the whole thing, but we can also use the backpropagation and the differentiability to really emphasize those constraints and the mass and energy and water constraints now as part of all of that. And that can be used to retrieve global parameters just through the assimilation. We might not directly be able to observe the right state, but because of the consistency of the model across time and the differentiability, we can actually propagate those assimilated data. We can assimilate the data and constrain things over time and constrain the different parameters. So with that, I'll be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Pierre. That was a very nice talk, and you have already few very interesting questions. So if you would like to go through them.
Yeah, that's in the Q&A. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, Nina. Yeah, hi, Nina. We are using cardamom for now. We haven't used a more complex model because we first wanted to, so especially these days, I'm a big fan of starting simple because the complexity of the differentiability was non-trivial. So making sure you can differentiate over time, you can get all of that running. So I would say we wanted to start simple. Now we can add complexity back, but I feel more comfortable starting simple and then adding that back. I don't know if that answers your question. But now we also added the energy constraint, so we don't need to have any assimilation of evapotranspiration. We can directly have thermal infrared, and we can run that at a finer resolution as well. So that's part of the complexity, you could say. Howard, can we get the seasonality of parameters? Yes, you should be able to get them. That's a great idea. And seeing how they change. Yeah, that's a discussion we had, especially you could think about VC max, for instance. Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I think that's doable. So the question from Matthias, there are things you can learn. Yes, frankly, it's no big deal because you can, so the question is, there are things we know, yes. And you can actually hard code them, that will just make things easier. However, I would just add as a caveat that there are things we know well at the leaf level. Another question is at the ecosystem scale, it can be a little bit trickier. Like for instance, what is really the temperature of the canopy at the ecosystem scale that can be more challenging than just a single leaf, right? So you could be surprised as well, and that could be a way to test. And in fact, for temperature, that's exactly something we are looking into. And so some of those things could be learned as well. Yeah. So I really see that as hypothesis testing. You can test how good of a job you're doing, and then you can say, and then maybe you're missing some pieces, or like kind of the structure might be important to retrieve the temperature and so on and so forth. So I really see that as a tool to iterate on processes and understanding as well. Anonymous attendee, I did not get if you perform Earth observation data assimilation or model calibration using Earth observation. So we do Earth observation data assimilation, but in a land surface view of the world, in the sense that we are just tweaking the parameters of the model to best match the observations. We don't do like a state estimate. We could actually do it, except the only thing we do, and that's a very powerful kind of added value of the model, is we can do an initial condition retrieval. So for instance, we can have, through the backpropagation, we can estimate the initial carbon pools, and that's super useful because you don't need the spin up, a huge spin up. So that's a huge advantage in my view, like instead of having a zoo of initial conditions. So yeah. What from Craig? Hey, Craig. what are the next steps? So the one thing we are working actively on and finishing up is energy, so that we can have assimilation of land surface temperature and infrared. So that seems to be working. There were some surprised when you really want to assimilate a lot of those things, because things can be very abrupt, especially many of the stability functions can be a lot trickier and very abrupt, so that can be challenging. What time scales? I would say that now it works well across time scales. The one where we are digging into that now is to look at long time scales like fertilization effects, etc. So looking at very, very long time scales is one place where we haven't looked too much into for now. We've looked a lot at interannual variability. We feel very confident with the interannual variability, like in the Amazon or semi-arid regions now. And we have also a modulation of the loss to actually push to get even more interannual variability. So that works well. And we can also get at shorter time scale. Key satellite data, yeah, geostationary would be great, especially for infrared temperatures. So that's really an area we are very, very interested in getting into the diurnal cycle, trying to constrain many of the processes at the energy and water nexus. With sensitivity to using model data as observation, is there a plan to transition to use of brightness, temperature, radiances? Yes, that's a very good point. That's something we are thinking of. You're right, because for now we are using soil moisture and VOD, and those are products, and we could have directly the brightness, temperature. We didn't use that at first because for two reasons. The first one was we were looking at too long timescales, so weekly timescales or daily timescales, but also because we didn't have the main issue was we didn't have the energy coupling. And so, but now when we'll have the energy coupling, we can get back to the brightest temperature to be at the raw level. So that would be better. Yes, good point. I hope I answered.
Thanks a lot, Pierre. I have a small question actually for the figure that you showed with the LAI and the GPP and Erico on one of the sites, I think. And there was a year, or that where the LAI was much lower in the observation than in the model.
Let me get back to this.
Okay.
So I turned up the. You mean here, right?
No, it's toward the end, actually.
Towards the end.
Yeah.
Here. Yes. So that's what I meant before. We had issues in terms of internal variability. So that was the first paper, but now we've developed a better mechanism for that. So what we do is we have two losses. We have a loss which is roughly a mean squared error, whatever, it doesn't really matter. But we're looking at short-term deviation, but we also really try to focus on the internal variability. So we have one added loss, which is focusing also on the internal variability, because especially when you're looking across space, so that's maybe less of an issue here, but even though that improves things. But what we realized, and I think it's pretty obvious, is that when you look across space, the variance that you have across space is huge. You go from a cold climate to the tropics, right? And when you look at the interannual variability, it's a lot smaller. Yes, we have an anomaly from year to year, but you're still a tropical forest, right? And that's a problem, right? Because it means that when you're learning everything together, the spatial gradients are just overwhelming, right? So you need to have a sense of like looking at anomalies. So what we do is we look at the anomalies. So we remove the seasonal cycle and we focus also on the anomalies across time. And that helps a lot because otherwise, again, the spatial gradient is it's completely overwhelming as a signal, right? And then you don't learn anything very useful. You just learn the the average climatology, but not really the internal variability. And I mean, that's for that, but I think it's a very generic statement, is that it's good practice to push also for this internal variability as an added loss, because when we train in space and time, the spatial component is just way, way, way stronger.
Okay, thanks a lot. Yeah, I think there's another. No, we are done with the Q&A, and yeah, with this I thank you very much, Pierre.
So pleasure. Thanks a lot for having me and
accept us,
us.
and yeah, it was a great talk, and see you all next.
And the code is available, I should have mentioned, but everything we do is open source, so if people want, yeah.
Nice, yeah. And the recording will be available online also for this talk. Okay.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a
Bye.
great day.
Bye.
Bye. Take care.